here's a ecosystem, very unique ecosystem that represents just 3%, 4% maybe of the terrestrial environment in the world, but packs a huge punch in terms of carbon storage, for example. If you look at the Hudson Bay lowlands, which are the largest intact peatland in the world, stores 5 times more carbon than the equivalent area in the Amazon rainforest. And if you look at the totality, that 3-4% throughout the world stores more carbon than all the forests combined. So if we want to address, the issue of climate change, it's kind of a no-brainer.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is with Edward Struzik. Now, I've had Edward on in the past, an episode very early on called Firestorm. He's an author. He wrote a book about Firestorm talking about the effects of the fire paradigm we're in now, the fire regime we're in now, and climate change and all that kind of stuff. And it was a really, really eye-opening, cool book. And he just released another one called Swamplands. Now, it is all about peat, all about peatlands, all about our cultural connection to those areas, why they've been treated the way they have, the mystical stuff, as well as the very scientific, right? All about the, species at risk, from pitcher plants to rare orchids, rare insects and moths and that kind of stuff, to caribou, to carbon capture. The importance of peatlands in carbon capture can't be understated. And it was just a really, really eye-opening book. We all kind of know wetlands and peatlands are important, but this book really, really hit it home for you, right? It just really points out how crucial they are and how important they are to not only protect, but to restore for multiple reasons, right? For flooding, for carbon capture, for species at risk, for all the things that I said and more. And it was just a fascinating book. He starts talking about the cultural importance of it, the history, into the scientific and all kinds of different things. And I definitely want to read it. Check it out. The book is called Swamplands: Tundra Beavers, Quaking Bogs, and the Improbable World of Peat by Edward Struzik. He's an awesome guy. He basically just travels the world following scientists around, learning from them, and then writes a book on it. It's awesome. I love it. Really enjoy talking to him. Very insightful guy. And I know you guys are going to learn a lot from it. So, this book is all about that, all about his quest to inform the world about peatlands and their importance. And I just really thoroughly enjoy speaking with him every time I get to. So you're going to love it. Sponsors, same as usual. West Fraser is the #1 sponsor for 2022. They've been with me for a while now, and they allow me to do what I want to do the way I want to do it, and I cannot thank them enough for their support. Awesome company. Thank you, West Fraser, for everything. Greenlink Forestry has also been with me since the beginning. Can't thank them enough. This would not be possible without them. Thank you, Greenlink. Let's dive into this conversation with Ed, talking all about the importance of peatlands for lots of reasons, as you will come to see. Very, very interesting. Here we go. I wanted to start off, actually, getting the idea for this book. Like, how did you go from the first book where I interviewed you for Firestorm, all about wildfires and climate change and learning to live with fire, to this story about peat? How did this transition happen?
Well, it was actually not a transition. It was sort of, two things that were born around the same time. And this book arose out of a trip that I had done on Banks Island down the Thompson River, which is the most northerly navigable river in the world of any length. And it was a month-long trip. And I was absolutely stunned by the amount of life that was on that island. There was at that time 88,000 muskox, which represented 2/3 of all the muskox in the world on one island. There was around 5,000 caribou at that time. There was the genetically distinct population of wolves, distinct in the sense that there was no need for them to migrate elsewhere. So they were quite satisfied to stay there. And so they kind of evolved separately from the rest of the Arctic population. There were 6 different freshwater fish species on the Thompson River, which you really don't find anywhere else in the Arctic. Hundreds of thousands of geese, including sandhill cranes. It was the life, that far north was really astonishing. And I was, got me thinking, what's the common denominator here? And I realized is that quite obviously there's enough food to sustain all those critters. And the thing that allows the food to grow is peat. Peat is, one of the great soil conditioners, a great medium for growth in the south as well as the north. And the peat, which is very obvious on Banks Island, is several feet thick. It's very noticeable. And got me thinking, is there's, this looks more like the north end of Scotland than it did any other Arctic island that I'd been on. And as I started exploring the so-called world of peat, I realized there is a story here. These are biological hotspots, courtesy of these peatlands, which are bogs, fens, swamps, and marshes that accumulate peat in waterlogged conditions. And in case your readers don't, or your listeners don't know, it's partially decayed vegetation that builds up over centuries. So in a cold environment where it's quite wet, the vegetation decays, but it doesn't disappear. It just sort of builds up layer after layer after layer. And so I just realized that it occurs pretty much everywhere in the world, but mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. And so I started visiting all these places and explored them and just started discovering so many different things that were absolutely unique about these places, as opposed to, the forest around them or the grasslands or, the alpine country. They are really quite special place in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I think, I don't think anyone's ever dove into this idea to the depth and scope that you have in this book, right? Like I think we're kind of in the age of environmentalism. People are aware of sustainability. They're aware of environmental ideas and the concern for climate change and all these kind of things. But like something like as simple as like wetlands, right? People are like, oh yeah, it's just like wet stuff, right? But like the idea of peat, I think people know what peat might know what it is, but they may not understand the significance. And so it was interesting for me to find that this was one of the only books that does this kind of a deep dive into the fascinating world of peat that I otherwise was unaware of for a large degree, as I found out as I read the book.
And me too, up to a certain point. You kind of take it for granted. My next acquaintance with it was we bought this old house in Edmonton that's 90 years old, and we couldn't figure out. We realized that we needed to get new insulation because there was frost on the walls on January days like we've had just recently. Yeah. And when
the old newspaper insulation, horsehair insulation doesn't really do the trick in -30.
That was actually peat.
Oh, it was peat?
Yeah, peat used to be a commercial form of insulation at one time. But the problem with peat is that once it exposes to air, it shrinks. It loses its moisture, and so it settles to about a fifth of its size. And so it was insulating the bottom fifth of the walls quite nicely, but the 4/5 on there was just nothing there. And it was a lot of fun trying to pale out, and it's a big house, it was quite the process paling it all out. And so that's another feature of peat that people, I think have long forgotten because it's no longer used as a form of insulation. But we've been there's been some really interesting discoveries as to, for example, why do rattlesnakes, Massasauga rattlesnake, how can they survive a Canadian winter in Georgian Bay, where the temperatures can go down to minus 20, 25? I mean, they're a reptile. It can be a very long, cold winter. They're getting warmer, but, they've always been there. So the question is how can they survive? And they've just recently discovered about 2-3 years ago that they den in peat. And because it keeps them warm enough, below the frost line or in the frost line to prevent them from freezing in winter. And turtles do the same. So it's an important feature in an ecosystem is that the other thing that distinguishes a lot of peatlands such as fens is that their fens are different from bogs in that they are fed by groundwater, not so much by precipitation, but by groundwater. And most of this groundwater, for example, in the Wagner Fen just outside of Edmonton, that water is always around 4 degrees Celsius. So it keeps, that underground area fairly warm. And so you can find these incredible orchids growing there in the springtime. And that's how they survive. They just feed off the warmth of those underground springs.
Yeah. Yeah. It was I have so many questions because going through your book, you went through everything from the folklore to the spirituality of it to the economic history to all the way up until, current day to ecological importance and carbon capture and all these different things. And I feel like I felt the same as when I read Firestorm in that I was overwhelmed with the amount of information, but that the point was definitely getting through and consistent and steady. Every paragraph, you're like, hey, pay attention. Peat's important. Peat's important. Peat's important. And it was really, really cool to see, that what I liked about Firestorm was in this, but in a totally different, obviously a different subject, right? But it was really, really cool. You mentioned the difference between like bogs and fens and that kind of thing. And that was something that caught me right off the bat, just as a forester, like very familiar with different types of wetlands, right? Just quite simply the title, Swamplands, right? How did you come up? Cause a swamp is a very specific type of wetland, and you talk about pretty much anything that has peat in here, which is not just swamps. So why swamplands? Why not peatlands or something else? What was the...
Well, it was mostly a marketing thing.
Okay, yeah.
Swamplands versus peatlands, is not quite as an attention grabber. But the reality is, there is some scientific basis to this, is that peatlands are formed by a kind of swamping. And most of that swamping, and say probably 80% of the peatlands of the world, comes from the recession of glaciers, all that water. So most of the peatlands are post-glacial phenomena. When, those glaciers that came down all the way to British Columbia, Washington State, all the way to New York City began receding, they, receded very quickly, to some extent, almost as fast as what we're seeing now. And they just resulted in huge amount of flooding. And of course, they filled up all the depressions that were there in the past that were scoured out by the glaciers and filled them up. And because it was still very cold, you got this cold, the vegetation that did grow and decayed, leaves and stems and whatnot, they just piled up on each other. And that's basically, they call it polutification, but polutification really is swamping. So swampland is actually an apt name for it. And it appealed both, to the marketing department, and it was good enough for me. And most people have accepted it when I've explained it to them. The scientists that have said, swamps are different, but when I talk about it, it is swamplands. So swamps and marshes don't accumulate as much peat as quickly as, say, fens and bogs, which are really the primary accumulators of peat.
Right. Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting. I knew you'd have a reason for it. I knew you didn't just throw it out there. It wasn't the publicist giving it to you, but I figured you had a reason. So I wanted to know what your reason was, because I figured you talked to enough.
If the book was called Polutification.
Yeah, no kidding, right? People might get a little confused, including myself, and be like, "What's Ed writing about polutification?" Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I figured you talked to enough scientists, right? Like that's your whole gig. You're jumping around the world, talking to scientists, talking to researchers and practitioners, and I figured I was like, he's very aware. So what is his reason? So yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I do want to get into the folklore and that kind of thing, because like I said, you went from kind of the spiritual, the history, and worked your way into the environmental and carbon capture, that kind of stuff. You kind of covered the gamut, right? You told the full story, I feel like, of what peat has done for us and its cultural importance, right? So I wanted to start right in the beginning when you start talking about the cultural significance. There was I think you said it wasn't distrust. Anyways, the deceitful nature of the folklore. Yeah, the fear, all that kind of stuff. And, we used to believe that it was responsible for disease and all these maladies and bad things in our nature. Why did you decide to include this? And what was the importance of including this to you and trying to tell this story?
Well, I think it was a setup to try to understand, from a cultural perspective, why is it that we revile these ecosystems, continue even to this day? I mean, is it just because they're buggy, wet? And the more I looked into it, the more I realized is that there was really a history associated with this revulsion of these wetlands. And, part of it was superstitions. Bogs and fens, give off methane, and they can actually, glow at night in a swamp. And so people would, be venturing along a trail or a roadside, and they would see these lights in the bog. And superstitions, arose around it, such as, the will-o-wisps, the jack-o'-lanterns, the moss people. From my heritage, when I used to skate at the on a frozen bog at nighttime with friends, my mother would warn me about Mora, Kikamora. She was this critter that had the kind of chicken feet and the long beak of some kind of bird, and very tiny. But she would follow you home at nighttime and then enter the house through the keyhole. And once she got in, look out, leave it to imagination as to why. So, this is one way of getting me home at night.
Right. Yeah.
So I didn't stay too late into the night. But there was always other, more interesting stories about it, is that, when she was brewing beer, fog rose over the bog kind of thing. But that there's so many of the American Canadian settlers brought over these superstitions with them, and we still have them with today. The New Jersey Devils hockey team is named after a swamp creature. And made famous by the NHL hockey team, but also Bruce Springsteen wrote and sang a song and did a video called "A Night with the Jersey Devil." Look it up. It's actually, and it's all based on this swamp creature. And if you look it up, people still claim that they, it's like Sasquatch. People still claim that they hear or see it in the bogs and fens of New Jersey, the Pinelands of New Jersey, which are massive remnant of, still quite big, but a remnant peatland that wasn't drained. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like, it totally makes sense. Once you explain it in the book, it makes sense to me why it was this source of, of spirituality, of the extra, extra normal kind of thing. Just because, people tended, still to this day, the average hiker's never walked through a fen, probably, right?
No.
Like it's just not a place you go.
I mean, one of the great lessons that I learned was I was invited to go on a Parks Canada trip, just me and James McCormick Warden, to hike across Ivivik National Park, which is a park in the north end of it's basically tundra, but it's massive peatland. And the idea, our instructions were to get to from Babbage Falls to the Firth River near the Alaska border, and to see, what kind of a hiking route it might be. And I think it was, a total of 35 kilometers. Well, in 6 days, we only got 8 kilometers because we were just like, it was just boot sucking.
Yeah.
And so we stay away from those. And it's one of the reasons why I think, they remain intact, is that most people see these places as wastelands. But also, just to get back to the days of the superstitions, is that many people, because, the smell that came, the sulfur dioxide that percolated from the bottom of a fen or a bog, they made this connection that it was related to diseases that would break out, be it the common cold, which developed in what they called swamp fever, or cholera. And so they called it the miasma on unhealthy soils. They didn't see it, as bacteria growing in a water supply, as it was most often the case. They saw that these peatlands actually generated diseases. And it was one of the reasons why there was a massive attempt to drain them, not only to turn it into farmland, but to get rid of the disease. And if you look at the history of Central Park in New York City, the primary purpose was to create a recreational area, a park, so that people could breathe and walk. But it was a swampland before that, and it was a massive 10-year effort to get rid of all of that water, all of that vegetation. And one of the other reasons why, was they believed that it was responsible for diseases such as cholera. And that idea continued right into the early 20th century. People still believed that swamps were the cause of disease.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. I was totally unaware of this connection to the superstition, and it totally makes sense tying it to our treatment of or lack of thought about peatlands, right? Up until even present day, right? When we think about, it just wasn't considered important. Like when people think nature, they think old growth on the coast, or they think a mountain vista with pine and Doug fir, or they think that kind of stuff. They're very seldom thinking black spruce and tamarack and what I mean, with just 20 feet of moss, right? It's just a different idea of nature for I think for the common person. So it's I'm not surprised when you started to lay it out. I was like, it just all makes sense, right? It's very, it all ties together. And even the political, right? Like you mentioned, politically speaking, across the world, there isn't a politician there isn't a politician out there that makes reference to peatlands that doesn't just call them a unproductive waste of space, right? I was like, that's interesting.
It was, the U.S. Congress passed 3 different Swamp Acts in 1849, 50, and 1860, and they gave away land, I think 65 million acres of swampland to the states, but on the condition that they drain them. And that was the whole purpose, was to create agricultural land and also to make the soils more healthy. And we think that that's just the relic of the past. But if you move, you go fast forward to say the 1950s and the 1960s, the National Research Council here in Canada hosted, I think it was 16 annual conferences on what they called they called it the muskeg problem.
Oh, okay.
And the idea was to bring in scientists from universities and from industry to figure out a way to, number one, to drain them. How do you drain them effectively? Or to find some way of being able to travel on top of them, or to build roads and bridges on top of them. And the whole purpose was they saw this as an impediment to economic growth, that, we needed roads to get into the hinterland. We needed to find a way of getting to the minerals that were beneath those peatlands. And so the idea was to, drain them, or to find a way of building, vehicles. Bombardier actually got involved in designing vehicles that could travel over muskeg. Not successfully, it turned out. Most of the time, all of these vehicles ended up getting swallowed up.
Right.
But so, even right into the mid 1960s, and you'll appreciate this, is that the one objection. So the meeting involved not only university scientists, the National Research Council, but the utilities were brought in, the forest industry, the mining industry, and the oil and gas industry was all brought in to put their heads together. And the one dissenter each year was the representative from the forest industry, who really believed that this was a big mistake, because that they created their own forests. And he said, some of the best wood that we get comes out of the forested fens. And he's right to an extent. They're maybe not the tallest trees, but they're certainly very hardy. They're miniature old growth forests is what they are. So sure. Many of the larches, say, if you go to Wagner Fen just here in Edmonton, on the outskirts of Edmonton, there are larches that are 400, 500 years old. And they've evolved, largely because they're hard to get at, but they've conditioned themselves to live in these environments, these swampy environments that other trees would not be able to survive in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a good reason now that that forest industry doesn't go into there, because you can't grow trees back very well. So it's pretty unsustainable. But but at the time, yeah, it's that's interesting to note that. I assume that there was always people who probably recognized that there was some kind of balance that needed to be struck between these things. But it's interesting to note the societal shift over time, right? From the viewpoint of as just an economic problem from which to deal with, to the current day where we're starting to think about it as a balanced system, right? How do we balance this all out? And especially in a time of climate change with floods and everything else and fires, we're only starting to realize more and more that we need to protect some of these areas, right? So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, with all that, like, what I never did ask you at the very beginning, I meant to, what was your hope for this book? Like, why? Like, I asked you, how did you get into this book? And you spoke about the beauty of these places. Why did you feel the need to write this book?
Well, I came to the conclusion that probably about midway through the research and the travels is that here's a ecosystem, very unique ecosystem that represents just 3%, 4% maybe of the terrestrial environment in the world, but packs a huge punch in terms of carbon storage, for example. If you look at the Hudson Bay lowlands, which are the largest intact peatland in the world, stores 5 times more carbon than the equivalent area in the Amazon rainforest. And if you look at the totality, that 3-4% throughout the world stores more carbon than all the forests combined. So if we want to address, the issue of climate change, it's kind of a no-brainer in my mind that we're going to get a bigger payback if we protect these areas or restore them, as they're doing in China, in Europe, Great Britain, the Scandinavian countries. Russia is even doing it. But it's not just all about carbon. I know that, a lot of people roll their eyes when they talk about carbon storage, but there's other things that peat does. And it, for example, filters water very effectively. And, so when sphagnum dies, it releases polysaccharides, which block bacterial growth. And it's one of the reasons why the Vikings, for example, use bog water on their long voyages, because the bog water would not go bad. It would not build up bacteria. And
Gotcha.
this came right up until the 1940s and 50s, where the U.S. Navy used to dock at the Great Dismal Swamp on the east coast of Virginia and fill up with bog water, because it was they understood that property of it actually, slowing the growth of contaminants. And if you look at why the Great Lakes, for example, are developing, they've got such a big algae problem right now. Part of it is temperature. There's no question about it. But the Great Lakes used to be surrounded by the Black Swamp on the American side of the border, Wainfleet Bog, and all the other bogs on the Ontario side of the border. But we've drained most of them, so there's no longer any peat there to filter out all of those nutrients that are coming from farms, and it goes straight into the Great Lakes, and it creates this algae. So there you have it. I mean, there's two things alone which makes it ideal to try to protect it and to restore it. And I've said this in a number of different articles, is that the Trudeau government has vowed to plant $10 billion of 10 I don't know how many millions of trees for how many.
It was $2 billion.
$2 billion for $4 billion or whatever. Yeah. I go ahead, but the fact is, we may be much better off restoring or protecting peatlands, or investing more money, most of the money into that, or an equal amount of money in that, because it doesn't take a lot. There was a study done, I think, out of the University of Waterloo, is that, 1 acre or 1 hectare of peatland is just as effective. It doesn't lose its effectiveness in storing carbon or filtering water or all the other things. It also, for example, the other thing is that, as as every firefighter knows, is that wetland is a firefighter's best friend on the landscape.
If it's wet,
any number of firefighters on the ground in front of a mega fire, but the best you can hope for outside of weather coming in is basically either slow it or steer it in another direction. But if it hits a wetland, it either slows considerably or it stops. And one of the really vivid examples of what happens when you get of a peatland is the Horse River fire at Fort McMurray in 2016. One of the things that caught the firefighters off guard was that when it approached this fen just on the outskirts of Fort McMurray, they expected it to be slowed. But when it hit the fen, it just took off. It sped up considerably, and the reason being that the firefighters didn't know that the forest department, another part of the forestry department, drained that fen as a forest experiment to grow trees. So what you had was you had black spruce, which is highly combustible, growing on top of dried out peat. And so when it hit there, it just took off like a shot and flared into Fort McMurray. And so they were totally caught off guard there. So there's another service that these peatlands provide us. And I guess I would top it off is that, trees need a lot of nutrients to grow. They need a lot of water to grow. Nutrients kill fens and bogs. They've evolved without it. And that's why the plants are unique in that, picture plants and sundews, they don't get most of their food from the soil or the peat. They get most of their food from bugs that they capture, because there's just not enough nutrients in that soil. And so you don't need a lot. All you need really is a re-wetting of the landscape, and basically the seeds that you can easily get from mosses, which are incredibly difficult to destroy unless you dry it out or drain it. But a tree, as you know, a forest can, with 100,000 trees, 200,000 trees can burn in a day.
Oh yeah.
So the question is that, where's our money better spent, or do we divide it up? And I really think that peatlands just offer a much, much better opportunity to deal with climate change issues. And if I can natter on here, also mitigate floods. The reason why Calgary flooded and Canmore flooded so badly in 2013, when we had that rain on snow of it in the Rockies, was that Calgary's drained 70-80% of its peatlands. So when all that water came rushing down out of the mountains, there is not any of those mosses there. Mosses can absorb 25% of their moisture. There just wasn't the peat there to absorb it. So it would have been a lot less catastrophic had there been peatlands around the city to absorb it.
And I remember when that happened, it was almost immediate. Within a couple of weeks, there were stories about that, right? Like within a week or so of that flood happening, there was all kinds of columns saying like, this is what happens when, for urban sprawl and agriculture, that we drain everything to try and make it an upland site, right? You end up just with this straight shot, basically a water slide right from the mountains right into downtown Calgary, right? And I think that was a cautionary tale, right? It kind of brought it to people's attention right away, for sure. And yeah, the point that you made in the conclusion of the book about the 2 billion trees thing, right? That the Canada's contribution to commitment to plant 2 billion trees in 10 years to try and help mitigate climate change. Yeah, and then you brought up this fact of restoring these peatlands. It's something I never even considered. How much. Besides northern Alberta, Fort McMurray, that kind of area where they're being drained constantly for oil and gas exploration, how many of these bogs and fens and that kind of thing do you think are still just there but dried out, that all you need to do is just provide water back into it to try and get that carbon capture back in? Like, how feasible is that task? You know what I mean? Of trying to re-wet these areas.
It all depends on the site. And there's there's Laval University has developed it. It was actually, the expertise was started here by Dale Vitt at the University of Alberta, who was tasked to restore and experiment peat that had been harvested at a number of different sites around Alberta by the peat moss industry. And he was able to essentially regrow these peatlands by combination of factors. Is that you bring back the water, but you also provide the seeds for the mosses and other plants to grow, and that strategy is becoming increasingly more effective, and including in I think people might be horrified, but in the oil sands is that they've destroyed massive amounts of peatlands, stripped, several feet of peat to get at the bitumen below. But because we do have, at least, on the surface, wetland restoration legislation in play, they've been compelled to try to restore some of those peatlands. So they've brought in people like Dale Vitt, Dave Cooper from Colorado State, to try to regrow peat in the oil sands. They're having great difficulty doing it because, the destruction is so great there. But in other parts of, like Seba Beach, for example, in Alberta, they've very successfully restored that almost to its original state. It's not perfect, but it's certainly, 86% of the plants that once were there are there now. That's a fairly healthy ecosystem. It's storing carbon rather than giving off carbon. And it's fairly inexpensive. It's cheaper to do it than it is to try to grow a forest. And the other thing about, as any forester would know, is that trees can come back on their own. They don't really need to be planted. We do it in terms of plantation, but there's a natural process that takes place. And we see this happening after every fire. The steeds are dispersed, the cones, coniferous cones open up and they disperse seeds and things grow back quite nicely. So I think to some extent, if we leave nature on its own, the forests will take care of themselves, although I'm not so sure now because of, the intensity of the fires that we're seeing and burning at increasingly shorter intervals, whether that's going to happen. And that's why I pause. I don't oppose, but I pause to think about, spending so much on growing trees when we could spend an equal amount and getting a much bigger payback by restoring fens and bogs. And then save the forests at the same time because they are natural breaks so that they will actually reduce the impact of forest fire in the future. So it will actually save the forest without having us to grow them. Let Mother Nature grow the forests and bring back the peatlands to, help buffer these forests from big megafires.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of there's a lot of skepticism with the 2 billion trees thing because what is the definition of planting a tree and what is the definition of success? Like how long does that tree need to survive for them to get paid, right? And that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of skepticism around that, and I'm you know what I mean. There's always people that'll take the quick buck and plant a tree, walk away, and say, yeah, I did it, and so I know there was a lot of skepticism around that.
But think of this: if you have $2 billion to invest, the other thing that you could do is you could have, as some indigenous communities are doing, getting the forest industry to help them thin out trees to reduce the impact of forest fire down the road. If we do that, more in strategic places in the boreal forest, along with restoring fens and bogs, then we got two things that help the forest in the future, rather than simply naively thinking that if we plant billions of trees, that it's all going to come up rosy.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really cool idea. Like I love this idea of peat restoration as a climate change, as an assistance to climate change solution, right? Like I think it's absolutely, it should be done. Why wouldn't it be done, right?
And thinning out the forest, because if you thin out the forest, you reduce the intensity of fire, and also you retain more moisture in, there are less trees to suck up all that moisture, and more of that moisture would go into wetlands, as would probably have done if we weren't so aggressive in suppressing fires. So these are two things that I think that we can do to move things forward in a very positive and more likely successful way than to plant a lot of trees.
Yeah, to me, one of the real promising ways I see the 2 billion trees thing to go well is there's a company here, it's an nonprofit organization here called Project Forest that I've had on before, and they're trying to reforest some agricultural areas around the city here, right? So they're not doing plantations, they're trying to plant, alder and rose and a bunch of different tree species and mosses, and they're trying to plant a forest, right? And to me, recreating that forest on what was, canola field or whatever, that seems purposeful. But you're right. Like just planting plantations, you're not going to end up with that. You're not going to end up with that carbon storage in the soil the way you would with peat, right? And there's a lot of. I like the idea of the trees, but I think I like your idea of peat. It seems like a more long-term solution, and that if you can restore that peat, it can pretty much be there forever. Even if the top burns, you still have peat below, right? So I like that idea. And you have trees too. So I think there's definitely, it's an outside the box thing. And I'm not surprised that the government hasn't tapped into it, but I like that thought. And I would like to see some, I'm going to be keeping my eyes out for people that are trying to accomplish that kind of thing, because it's definitely an interesting idea for sure.
And if you look at, say, Edmonton was one massive wetland. Even at the turn of the century, right into the 1930s and 40s, the subdivision of McKernan was a lake in the 1930s that where people went to skate. There was a trolley that went to it to take people from the north side to the south side on the high level bridge. If you look at historic photos of Edmonton, we don't have all of these trees in the river valley that we do now. That's really a facet of us basically keeping fire out of our valley. And it would have been more wetland than it would have been forest. And now if you walk through there, and I live, on top of the river valley by the university, and I walk down there every day, and people should have a look. All the birch are gone. And in fact, many people probably don't have memory of birch anymore. It used to be such a common tree in the river valley, but it's gone. aspen are dying. Probably 50% of the aspen in the river valley are gone. The conifers are having trouble growing. It's not a healthy forest. And it's because we basically kept fire out of it. We've created a forest instead of a peatland. And the results really aren't that pretty. It kind of, from the air, it looks good. And, from a cultural point of view, we all kind of feel fuzzy about the fact that we got Crees joined down there. But if you walk through it, it is not a healthy ecosystem down there.
Mm-hmm. It's very dense. It is very, it's constantly disturbed, right? Like we've, at my current job that I do, like my day job, we did an inventory, kind of a primary land vegetation inventory for the city of Edmonton. And we did some soil pits and some digging, and what you think is say the original plant species and that kind of thing, you dig down 3 feet and you're finding oil cans under there, under, an 80-year-old spruce tree. And, and we also found like bison heads and stuff down there too. But the river valley has been disturbed so many times that, and like you said, there's no fire, there's no cultural burning, there's the natural processes are kind of gone. I still love the river valley, but like you said, there's definitely, it can be done more intelligently, but like, you come to that problem of educating the public, right? Like, how are you going to show the public, like, okay, we're going to burn out your favorite walking spot this year, but it's a good thing. Like, they're going to be pissed.
Jasper National Park did it, and Banff is starting to do it. And they've brought it in, as an education program as they walk these people through. And if you did it in Edmonton, and I've been advocating this for some time, is that if we just burn small areas, little areas that we know that we can control, so that it doesn't get out of the way and burn all the houses in Windsor Park and adjoining subdivisions, and then just invite the public to see what happens. Yep. If we do it in the spring, you can show them.
Make it a good news story.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Make it a good news story. Make it a big thing, right?
Yeah.
Like absolutely. I think it can be done for sure.
I think it can be done. It's just that we're in some ways, we've got knuckleheads that basically we hire that we elect as politicians. No, it's true.
I always love our politicians. They're the best politicians.
They have no vision. They're risk averse. They do, we have politicians that continue to do things the way they've done for the last 50 to 100 years. And they're reluctant to embrace the challenges that we're facing now. And so this is the reason why we're behind the 8 ball. It's really, there's no risk in planting a bunch of trees. Everybody loves a tree. It's where the word tree hugger comes from.
Easy one to sell. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that, what we need to do is start electing politicians that have, bold new ideas to deal with an urban forest that really is in need of renewal of basically the biggest forest environment that we need to adapt to, the challenges of climate change. And I find it just ironic that the places in Canada that are way ahead of everybody else are in the Indigenous community that have control of their land, that are not afraid of fire and not afraid of thinning out forests, because no one is going to tell Indigenous people at this stage of our history, and treating them is that you can't do that. Yeah. And so they're doing it, and very successfully. If you look at the First Nations in the Kelowna area, and they've been burning and thinning out forests, and the communities outside of those areas are not doing it, and they're the ones that are burning whenever the Okanagan burns.
Yeah. You know what I just realized? I think we need in Edmonton, we need a city councillor that's just for the river valley, just for the treat area. The city councillor just for there. The whole city votes on it, and that person's responsible for the river valley health, like and recreation, all that kind of stuff. Why not, right?
Well, Let's do it. There's a plan afoot to turn it over to Parks Canada.
That's right. I remember hearing that.
River Valley of Edmonton and Saskatoon, and whether Parks Canada will. There's another risk-averse organization, but they have finally embraced fire as a rejuvenating force in the national parks. And
Yeah.
they're very slow at doing it because they're limited to such a small period of time in the fall and the spring, because they don't want to have tourism impacted by smoke.
Well, it's government, right? There's a lot of red tape to go through before you want to burn a piece of property. Yeah.
Which is ironic because in doing that, what they've done, we've had like 3 out of the last 4 summers where it's been almost impossible to travel in the national park because of all the smoke that's been wafting in from BC or from different parts of Alberta. And so we're paying the price now for something that we should have been doing decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we should shift gears here a little bit. We'll get back to your book. There was a part in there where you were talking about endangered species and how the majority of endangered plant and insect species in the world are in these wetland areas, right? And I found that was an interesting point. I always wanted to ask somebody this because you come into these conversations with there's a lot of different perspectives that come into the conversation about endangered species, right? And I think everybody inherently kind of wants to protect endangered species to a certain point. And the people have different lines of where they'll draw the line and say, okay, well, we'll just give up on that one, right? So for you, how do we prioritize these species, and how do you personally think about what is the importance of these species to conserve, and like how much time and energy should we be putting? Because there's people who will say, oh, these plants and animals evolved during the ice age, right? And evolution's always moving forward, and at some point we'll have to draw the line because they're just not going to be able to make it on their own. And so, what do you say to those people, and how do you justify? Not justify. I shouldn't say justify, because I feel like I'm with you on the subject, but I like to get people's opinions on how they put this into words, right? Because I think it's a conversation that doesn't get happened a lot. People just kind of pick their side and stick to it, but we never talk about the middle ground.
Yeah. Well, let's just look at it from a holistic point of view. Is that we have, say, most of our peatlands are found in the boreal forest, and so we have what I think is something between 3 to 5 billion birds that fly from the south, as far from the tip of South America, most parts of the United States, that nest in our peatlands. And so there's the other analogy to the tree huggers, is that we've got a lot of people who love birds, and if you continue to eliminate all of these peatlands, these birds aren't going to nest. They're not grassland birds, for example. They need that forested peatland or, the fens and bogs to keep them, to sustain them down the road.
For sure.
And the price, I think we've kind of reached a stalemate. It's kind of like World War I, where everybody's in the bunkers on both sides, shooting at each other. And I think that if we looked at the value of peatlands, say to, where, for example, where does everybody want? Nobody that I know of wants grizzly bears to disappear from the landscape. But Think about it is that if we have an old growth forest, the canopy is so thick that all of the root vegetables, the berries, the blueberries, cranberries that the bears eat when they can't find meat disappear. And if there's the peatlands, probably I don't know that there's ever been a study done on it, but probably most of their food comes from peatlands. If you think about it. On the other hand, where does a grizzly bear go when the forest is on fire? So the forest fire will manufacture food, bring back those root vegetables and the berries that they need to sustain themselves. But think about it, where do they go when there is a fire in the forest? I haven't seen a study that outlines it, but you can bet that those that survive probably hunker down in a wetland where the fire can't get them. There has been a study on caribou, is that caribou spend 50% of their time on peatlands, presumably because that's where most of their food is found.
That's right. Yeah.
I think that what we really need to do, instead of saying we've got to save every single caribou, and I'm all for that, but I think that probably the more effective strategy is to find out where these biological hotspots are. How can we maintain them or restore them so that we create more food, manufacture more food for those animals, which is really the big factor. I mean, hunting is not no. Killing off caribou or grizzly bears. Really, it's the lack of food availability, the habitat. And I think restoring that habitat, protecting that habitat is really key.
The habitat connectivity too. I think mostly in Alberta, it's the connectivity of the habitat. Not that it's not there, but that the connectivity is broken up, allowing for sight lines for wolves and even just roads, stuff like that. Yeah, for sure.
If you look at the oil sands, the number of roads and seismic lines that they've created and they haven't restored, has really been an impediment to, the survival of these species. They've created, pathways for wolves to move in. They've haven't allowed for regeneration of a lot of that food that they need. And there's a bit of a disconnect, and I think is still happening. For example, is that the forestry industry can be trying to go into the same place as the oil industry, but the oil industry would say, no, you can't. We'll have our separate road. You build your separate road, and so we've just got to. I mean, some of it is just common sense. Is that if you're going to build a road, make it just one road instead of a whole bunch of different roads.
That's a conversation I have quite a few times on this podcast. So just the lack of communication between industries created a lot of extra anthropogenic impact that was completely unnecessary.
It is, yeah. Totally. And I've talked to many people in the forestry industry, actually, even 30 years ago, that were saying this, is that we wouldn't build a road into this area if we could use the road that was built by the oil and gas guys, but the oil and gas guys won't let us because, they believe this is a security issue and they're just not willing to accommodate us. So they build another road. And so this is why we've just got this scattershot network of roads that get you in just about any place you want to go.
Yeah, it's unfortunate to say the least, for sure. Yeah, it was just an interesting idea, like the whole, because I feel like that's always the question around where do we draw the line with endangered species, right? And like, how do we, like, what fundamental reason do we have for conserving these plants and animals, and how do we prioritize their importance? It's always interesting to see where people draw the line, because I think everyone can get on board with, like, yes, we should protect caribou, but what is in our day and age, or in this day and age, dollars and cents is how we measure value. So what is each caribou worth in a dollar value, right? Is it $1 million? Is it $10,000? What is it, right? And I find it interesting to have those kind of philosophical discussions about what kind of a value do we put on it, and at what point is it not worth the investment or whatever. Not to say, I just find it interesting, right? Because those are the confusing areas where people aren't really sure how to feel about it, right? Because you're having the real hard discussion, right? So, but
I think we should be having some discussions as to the nature of some of the resource industries that we try to push forward. And I think a real good example is coal mining in southwestern Alberta, up in the headwaters of the Old Man River and the Crow's Nest River. This is, if you think about it, all those trees would be cleared out of there. If you have any kind of tailings pond break, as they did on the BC border going into the United States, I think Teck Resources just paid $60 million fine. This is the water that goes into the prairies. So the question is, and there's a lot of wetlands up there that store that water, filter that water. And if we get rid of it and we just turn it into, rock, it's just going to slide out of the mountains and, more as a flood than as a trickle of water that we want to see. And this is going to get even worse down the road as climate change starts continues to dry up the prairie. So I think we have to analyze as well which of these natural resources do we want to exploit? And if we do so, how do we do them effectively? And I think that, there can be a strategy where, like I said earlier on the conversation, is that if you restore peatlands, you're actually going to make forests more resilient to things such as wildfire and drought.
Absolutely.
That's the moisture there. So I think we kind of have to evaluate a whole bunch of different things. And endangered species is, I think, the great bonus that we have. That if we just target one species, the spotted owl is a renowned example. Where do you go? To what end does that come to? Nobody really is happy in the end. But if you create the habitat, protect the habitat, or recreate the habitat, then everything else, I think, falls into place. And it doesn't have to be a single species that is the focus of our attention. It can be a whole variety of species that are associated with that ecosystem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point about the coal mining versus, the forested area and the wetlands and the ecology of the area, it's more and more I've started to recognize that human beings, at least in Western culture, we do a pretty shit job of valuing future resources. We tend to forego the benefit of the future for the short-term gain of the now, right? We're kind of garbage at investing in our futures. We're not very good at it. And I think that's where stuff like coal mining comes in, right? Is we're just totally missing the boat on where society's heading. And we just fail to recognize that there's so much value over the next thousands of years in maintaining that ecology that totally, in my perspective anyways, in my view, most likely outvalues any kind of profit you can gain from coal mining, right? But that's my very biased perspective, but I find it interesting that we continue to make that mistake, right?
Well, you go back to 1911, there was a forester by the name of Abraham Knechtel who worked for the Dominion Forest, which is now the Canadian Forest Service. And in 1911, we created the forest reserves in southwestern Alberta with the sole purpose of two purposes. One was to protect the headwaters of those rivers because they saw them as invaluable to water supplies for ranchers and farmers down below, and also to protect, maintain forest for timber harvesting. And Knechtel, I'll send this to you. I have it in the book, actually, where he makes a connection between these wetlands, these headwaters, the importance of maintaining these forests, but added into it, he pointed out, is that one thing we need to get back on the landscape are some form of herbivore to replace the bison that all disappeared.
Oh, yeah.
And that was
Lord,
cattle.
No kidding.
So, and initially ranchers were not allowed to go into the forest reserve, but they realized they had some really big fires in 1911, was that without bison to keep the grass down, things just burn like crazy. So if you bring back the rangelands and allow the ranchers to graze their cattle, they create fire breaks, they keep the grass down and prevent the forest from burning. So, these ideas are not necessarily new. They've been around for more than 100 years. It's just that we haven't really learned from the past. And I think that's the subject of my next book on fire.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's called the Past and Future History of Fire, and it's more of a book about the cultural history of fire in Canada than it is about the scientific approaches.
Have you, just out of curiosity, have you spoken with Amy Cardinal Christensen?
What's that?
Have you spoken with Dr. Amy Christensen from NRCan?
I have talked to her. Yeah, in fact, she is in the book.
Perfect. I was going to say perfect. I was like, you need to talk to Amy for sure. She's definitely got something to contribute to your book for sure. So that's good. I'm glad that happened. Yeah. I'm really happy to hear that. Yeah. I was actually going to mention to you the cultural burning thing and curious, but that's a different book. We'll talk about that next time when your next book comes out.
Okay. All right. This stay tuned.
Yeah. This summer. Okay, there we go. So it won't be that long. There we go. Perfect. So I was really excited when I got to the couple chapters about the Wagner wetland and the Clyde Fen up here around Edmonton, just because that's where I live, right? Not because we were talking about them, but I got really excited because I've never really been into entomology, right? Like I took it in school, and like I know John Spence, you're the guy, your go-to guy.
Yeah.
He taught me entomology and that kind of thing, and I found it interesting enough, but it was never something that I dove into. When I was reading your chapter, I listened to the audiobook version. When I was listening to it, I got really, really excited about the idea of all of these. You were describing all these rare moths and insects and even the plants, like the pitcher plants and the orchids and that kind of thing in these bogs and fens just around Edmonton. I immediately found myself planning excursions this summer with my wife and daughter into these areas to go and find some of these things, right? Like it was exciting I found it interesting that I'm in the world of environmental stuff, sustainability, forests, all that good stuff. Yet I live 20 kilometers away from a world-renowned ecological hotspot of, these insects and plants, and didn't even know about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I just found that fascinating. In Clyde Fen, you talked about the abundance of pitcher plants there, and pitcher plants are something that I've been hearing about for a long time, and I've seen a couple, but never really seen like a crop of them, right? Like a crop's a bad word for it, but you know what I mean? I've never seen an abundant amount of them. So I would love to go, and I definitely want to go check that out. But I was just excited. I think anytime that a writer can get somebody to care about something that they previously didn't care about, you're doing your job. So nice work.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. And I guess it helps that I know some of the characters you were talking about. So that helps me bring some visual aspect to it as well. But it was really, really cool. And I hope to get people, if people are listening to this around the Edmonton area, it's what's called Wagner Natural Area.
Wagner Natural Area. It's just on the highway going to Jasper. Yeah. It's fairly nondescript. There's just a little sign that says natural area, turn left. And it's tiny, but it really comes alive in, say, late May, June, when you have, just dozens of different kinds of orchids coming into bloom. And it's a place where you have to look down rather than up to really appreciate how special these places are. The other really fascinating thing about it is that they tried to do an inventory of different of insects many, many years ago. And I think there's 1,500 types of wasps that are basically new to nature and that they haven't got names.
That's wild.
And I think we're just discovering new things about peatlands almost, monthly. For example, the pitcher plant, we now know in Algonquin Park that they eat salamanders. Yeah. Which is, hard to kind of come to grasp with, albeit juvenile salamanders. But, mostly everybody thought it was just flies and mosquitoes. But they actually consume salamanders. And
anything that falls in, right?
Yeah, anything that falls in is they can digest. And so it's one of this, the world that we've ignored for so long that I think there's so many new things to discover that it's just worthwhile paying attention to these spots. And it doesn't take a lot. For example, we're not going to lose a lot by protecting a 2 or 3 hectare wetland. It's not like big national park that you want to set aside hundreds and hundreds of thousand hectares of land. They need not be big to really pack a big punch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially around urban areas, right? The urban sprawl, I think, is probably, I can think of one area just around Edmonton right now where they just drained a swamp to build, I think it was a baseball diamond or something. Yeah. And it was like, what the hell, guys? Like, what are we doing here? Like, why? The amount of gravel you had to put in there, like, why? What are you doing? And so it's just like we just have to start thinking about it a little differently, right? It's frustrating to see that kind of stuff still happening. But yeah, I think you're right. Like it doesn't seem like it would take much to have a huge positive change in the direction of securing some of these peatlands for the future, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The world's not going to end if we have, one less baseball diamond, but, there's obviously some other place you can put the baseball diamond. We still have, all-terrain vehicles that have these competitions as how far can you go across a muskeg. There's muskeg races before you sink, and, which in my mind is a knucklehead sport. I mean, why do it?
Yep. It's a lot of fun. I used to do it in my when I was younger. I think it was the coolest thing ever. It was so much fun. But then as I kind of grew older and started to recognize what I was doing, I was like, oh yeah, this is ridiculous.
It is, and all we need to do is just say stop it. It's like reason why the Fort McMurray fire probably started was an all-terrain vehicle that was going through, and some twigs got caught in the muffler, and that probably is what triggered it. It's just easy to say, let's just close off the forest until we get a little rain.
It's easy for you and I to say that, but the politicians, they don't think it quite so easy, apparently.
Yeah, but it's easy to give out, hundreds of millions of dollars in competition as well. They all smile and glad hand when that happens. But it's a much more sensible thing to just say, well, let's save $300 million here and just, slow things down until we get a little rain. Or let's do things a little differently. So some of this is just basic common sense.
Totally. Absolutely. The politicians have to be willing to disappoint some people to make the right choice for the long term, right? It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, I know you got to get going in about a few minutes here, but I do have two more questions. Hopefully we'll get to both. But at the end of the book, you talked about peat farming and restoring peat and that kind of thing. So we spoke a little bit about how we can restore peat and that it's doable. We're learning the science of it. And one line that I found really interesting in there, and it was a quote you had, I'll probably misquote it, but something about resource extraction is inevitable. You know what I mean? That's just going to happen it's the nature of human beings. And so we need to do the resource extraction that we do. This is me kind of going off of that quote. The resource extraction that we do now needs to be sustainable, right? And so I don't really know, is peat farming, is it possible to be done sustainable? Is it being done sustainably? Is that part of not necessarily a climate solution, but a solution to our sustainable future? Is peat farming a part of that?
You mean growing peat or the growing or harvesting peat moss?
Harvesting peat moss, and then my understanding is that the peat moss harvesting that's going on is supposedly going on at an interval that's allowing it to regrow, but I'm not sure. So I wanted to know your opinion on that.
I mean, they understood at the right around the turn of the century, the industry, which is, Canada is the biggest exporter of peat moss in North America. Most of it goes to the United States, but sometime around the turn of the century, they realized that their ability to do that was going to be limited by what was happening in Europe, where they began to recognize that the land sinks when you drain these wetlands. Their whole flooding occurs. You have more wildfire in places like Russia. And so they started hiring scientists to see if they could just restore those peatlands they'd already harvested, which is a good thing. I think probably the ultimate solution is just to find an alternative to peat moss as a soil conditioner. But as I talk to most of the horticulturists I talk to is that there's really nothing quite as good as peat moss. So the question is that, how much of the land do we give up, or do we just force them to, restore what they're doing? I have to, at least give them a pat on the back. It's the one industry that has really understood that they're trying to get ahead of the curve. And to some extent, they've been successful. And their footprint is awfully small. I think that the bit more important thing for us is to stop cities from draining peatlands to create new subdivisions, baseball diamonds, demand that the oil and gas industry restore peatlands. At a rate in which it can actually be done, and that's just not happening. As we have legislation in place that compels them to restore peatlands, but there doesn't seem to be a timeline. And so by the time, it's all over, say for the oil sands in Alberta, I suspect that most of those peatlands will remain, they will not be restored, because it takes a long time, to do that, and especially in that area where they've been excavated to the point that they've been excavated.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a totally different situation up there. I don't know how you go from having, fens and larch and black spruce to having a pine hill with a lake and call that ecological restoration. I'm not sure, but I do know people that are in there doing some of that. I know they're doing everything they can to make it right. But yeah, the restoring peatlands, when they've been, like, peat farming is they're taking the top layer off, right? Like, there's still peat underneath. It's not like they're digging all the peat out right down to mineral soil. But yeah, in the oil sands, it's gone. It's just
they're digging gone. 200 feet down, and they're diverting all of the groundwater away from that area so it doesn't fill up. And also,
it's another level. Yeah,
they're also re-injecting the salts, that they once used into the ground, and so you just have a combination of things that makes it extremely difficult, very expensive to restore. We can learn from these mistakes, and we have been learning from them. We just got to move forward with them. If you're going to invest, if we have a government that's willing to invest $4 billion to grow 2 billion trees, I really think that if you use $4 billion to restore peatlands, you really are going to have much more success in storing carbon, filtering water, buffering forests from wildfire and communities from wildfire, and protecting endangered species. And it's such a tiny footprint on the landscape that not a lot of people are going to notice or say, what's going on here.
Yeah.
It's not.
I think that's a super... Yeah, sorry. I think it's a super interesting concept. In the conclusion when you were talking about that, I think that got me the most excited out of anything in the book. Oh, good. I was like, oh yeah, you're right. Like that's. I wanted to spend some serious time talking about it. We've discussed the concept, and yeah, I hope to see more movement in that direction, because it definitely does seem it's something I've never even thought about, never considered. But yeah, why not? Right? Like you said, it just seems like a win-win-win. It's awesome. So I did have one actual final question, not about peatlands, just about writing. I wanted to know what do you see your job as a writer? Because I feel like there's, I'm trying to word this in a way that kind of makes sense here. I wrote it down. Might have to read it. Where did I write it here? Oh yeah, there we go. That's what it was. Okay. So yeah, like how do you see your job as a writer? Because obviously you're trying to tell an interesting, intriguing, cool story, right? And how do you balance the difference between, like a scientific paper, like telling the accurate, full, comprehensive truth, versus what I always have a problem with documentaries. Because documentaries, it's very cherry-picked a lot. Not all, but you know what I mean? A lot of times it's very cherry-picked information. It's not the full swath. It's not the full picture. So how do you balance that idea between telling the truth as much as you possibly can with a cool story and not being misleading? Like how do you, because I know you can't put everything into a book, right? So how do you balance that out? I imagine it's very, very challenging.
Not really. I think that, I approach things that not everything is black and white.
Right.
And that, you just can't say that there's evil on one side and good on the other, that it's much more nuanced than that. But I think the primary purpose is for me to entertain people, by translating complex scientific issues in a way that, if I was having, at a dinner party, people would actually listen to me and say, that's cool. And I often try that out, at a dinner party, not so much anymore, but, I'll throw this out and I'll gauge, do people find this interesting? And so I go off from there. So it's really a lot about storytelling and trying not to approach things in a kind of black and white way, where you have good on one side and evil on the other side. Although we have more and more of that, But I just think, and I also just try to be more positive instead of saying, the sky is falling, that I think that there are pathways in which we could move forward. And here's what people are telling me. Here's what I've learned. And so the message is trying to be optimistic and trying to not make villains and heroes out of too many people, because I think that, people are a little wise to that now.
Yeah. And I appreciate that in your writing. Even in your first book that I read, Firestorm, that was the first one that I read. And I got that gist, right? That you weren't out there with a crusade. You're just kind of like, I have this interest. These are the people that are involved in this interest. This is kind of their role. This is where things might be going poorly. This is where things might be going well. And I always got the gist that you were fairly comprehensive and fair with, even though it's all very interesting and very, it got my juices flowing a lot of times, right? My emotional response was there while I was reading the book. I didn't feel it was, for example, I don't feel that someone from the oil and gas industry that's a reasonable person will read your book and go, well, fuck this guy, right? Like you can read it and go like, yeah, what he said is those are true things. You weren't going off on a tangent about your own personal feelings about it so much. You were just kind of saying the facts and representing them in an interesting way that tells the comprehensive story. So I just really appreciate your writing. And that's why I wanted to ask you that question, because I felt like you weren't trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, or you're not trying to, sell an idea. You're just kind of like, this is a concern and here are the facts and what do you guys think? Right. And so, I really appreciate your writing style, and I appreciate you coming on today. This was a really good conversation, and I look forward to talking about your new book when it comes out this summer.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thanks for listening, folks. That was awesome, right? Who knew that peatlands were so important, so cool, so crucial, right? So if you got any questions for myself or for Ed, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will definitely get back to you. If you want to help me out, you can share this on social media, tell your friends. You can just get it out there in any way you can. If you got a big Twitter following or something, just start blasting these episodes out there and talk about how much you love it. That would be super cool. I would love that. Because I'm terrible at the social media thing. Need somebody to take it upon themselves. All right. We'll catch you guys next time. Take it easy.